In this video we'll discuss classical economics and also look at the Fisher equation of exchange. Now this is an important video because it underpins our understanding of current day economic approaches. It underpins a lot of thinking and debate about economics presently in the world, but it also gives us an understanding of the background for many economic policies, particularly policies related to fighting inflation, for example. So it's important that you go through this class very carefully and make notes, understand it. It's quite a long class, it's 94 slides, and it's quite detailed. So perhaps you want to have a break, perhaps once or twice, and stop the video and relax a bit, and then come back to it and complete it. But it's an important video in terms of our understanding of current day economic policy and the background of the economic system as it is today. So let's look at first of all what's meant by the classical system, and then we'll move on to discuss Fisher in more detail. The classical economists predate Keynes. They were around before Keynes. Keynes came on the scene. He published his book, John Maynard Keynes, in 1936. The book was called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, and that's usually abbreviated to the General Theory. So often when we read about economics, we see references to the General Theory. That's Keynes' book, which he wrote in 1936, but really the book became very influential from the end of the Second World War, from about 1945. And in fact, it's fair to say that nearly all capitalist countries following the Second World War, up to about, difficult to put a precise figure on it, but 1974, about then, all the world was Keynesian. Keynesian economic policy seemed to rule the thinking of all policymakers and governments, non-communist governments around the world. So a very influential economist with very influential ideas. But Keynes was critical of what he called the classical system. The classical system, the system that was there before Keynes. And as we'll see later in other videos, what's actually happened is we had the classical system, which in a sense Keynesianism replaced in 1945, and when Keynesianism faded away because of problems with that particular school of thought in the mid-1970s, it was replaced by a type of modified classical thinking again. So today economics is broadly based on the classical system. There's a lot we can see and understand in terms of government pronouncements and policies and so on, which can be traced back almost to the classical system, and we can see parallels between the two. So it's a very important class to look at. Now, the classical economists believed in the market system and in its ability to adjust automatically to full employment. So the classical economists believed that if the government left it alone, laissez-faire policy, if the government stayed out of the economy, the government didn't interfere or introduce policies or changes or try to artificially manipulate the economy, if the government simply stayed away, the economic system would automatically bring about full employment. That's the belief. So unemployment was not a problem for the classical economists. It could be adjusted to automatically. And what would happen in this world of the classical economists is that all prices would be variable. All prices would be flexible. They would move up and down. And all the markets would find simultaneously their equilibria, or at least they would be adjusting towards their equilibrium positions. And that would also be the case in the labour market. Labour the price of labour is the wage rate, and the wage rate would be adjusting. Some wages would be rising, some would be falling. Depends on supply and demand, depends on the scarcity of that particular type of labour. So some people will be paid more than others because they have skills that were in demand. But overall, the system would head towards full employment, and it would do so automatically. So they believed that if prices and wages were flexible, that's flexible upwards and downwards, then there is an automatic tendency for the economy to adjust to full employment. There are problems, practical problems, as we can imagine straight away here. Workers, for a start, don't like to have their wages cut. They don't mind having it increased, but having wages cut is a problem. That could lead to strikes and lead to labour issues and problems. And we understand the reasons why. People need the income to buy goods and services, to look after their families and themselves, and pay for accommodation and food and so on. So the workers are not happy about having wages cut. So it could be that wages are flexible upwards, but not downwards. But the classical economists believe that if wages were flexible in both directions, then the economy would adjust to full employment, because the labour market is like any other market. If unemployment did develop, it must be caused by such factors as labour market imperfections. Now, an imperfection in this case would mean, for example, trade unions resisting pay reductions, or it could be the immobility of labour. Labour is not moving, it won't move from one occupation to the next, it won't move from one region to the next. So if people don't move in response to market forces, that introduces imperfections, in using this language, which means the system would not adjust to full employment. There could be a loss of confidence on the part of investors that also would lead to unemployment and markets not adjusting. The whole system has to be flexible. And if unemployment is not flexible due to these type of imperfections, then that can lead to unemployment. That can lead to people out of work. So to avoid it, the classical economists are very simple in the sense that they want to have all markets flexible, including labour, up and down for increases and decreases, and there should be no artificial restrictions on, in particular, the labour market. Trade unions should not fight pay reductions. You can see it's a very abstract theory in some respects. It's almost inevitable, of course, that the trade unions and the workers will resist pay cuts. But if they do resist the pay cuts, then they may price themselves out of work. There are two problems with this view. The classical methodology is based on what's known as the partial equilibrium approach of microeconomics. Now, partial equilibrium, it means we look at one market only. We don't look at the markets being interconnected, the markets affecting each other. The partial equilibrium approach is just simply look at one market, ignore the others, or even assume that they don't affect the market we're looking at. Now, this is what we mean by partial equilibrium. It focuses on individual markets without feedback from the other markets. For example, if the price of one good increases, then there may be less income left available to purchase the other goods. In this way, all the markets will be considered to be linked. So we can see from this example that markets are linked. If we spend more on one product, we have less available to spend on another product. So the demand for one product will increase, the demand for the other product will fall. So they are linked. But the classical economists were basing their thinking on partial equilibrium, looking at one market only, and there were no other feedbacks from other markets. So the partial equilibrium approach must be contrasted with the general equilibrium approach that allows for the connectivity of markets. For example, how the movement of the price in one market will affect the price in other markets. So the classical economists made this assumption of partial equilibrium, looking at just one market, and that one market is not affected by others. Contrast that with what we call general equilibrium, where all the markets are connected, and if one market is affected, all the other markets will be affected as well, and they'll all feed into each other. They will all have influence over the directions in which prices and quantities are adjusting in each market, because they're all connected. So the classical economists just looked at one. So it's a very simple theory in that sense. Just look at the labour market. If there's unemployment, that means there's something wrong with the market. Something's not adjusting, perhaps the trade unions. So the policy recommendation would be to get rid of the trade unions, and that would cause wages to fall, and that would cause unemployment to be eliminated. Very simple. You can see immediately it's probably too simple, but just for the moment it's a very simple analysis. This is a very straightforward piece of thinking. Let's go through this again and talk about each of these parts, so we drive home this idea of partial equilibrium. So let's start with looking at the equilibrium focuses on individual markets without feedback from other markets. Well, let's say, take the labour market again. Let's say we have unemployment in the labour market. Now, this particular perspective would suggest that wages are too high, maybe caused by trade unions, as I just said, or caused by the workers resisting pay cuts. But if the workers had their pay cut, then they would have less income to spend on other goods. So prices in other markets would fall as well. And that means workers in other markets would have lower incomes. And if they have lower incomes, then that will feed back to the labour market, to the one that started it all. So what we've got is a connectivity in the markets. Each market is linked to the other. So partial equilibrium is not a very sophisticated way to conduct the analysis. But bear in mind, the classical economists were right at the start of the subject. Economics was a new subject, had just been introduced in a sense. It was developed on the continent, developed in England. There were people thinking about economic issues, and they had understood the market ever since the concept of the market had been articulated by Alfred Marshall in 1890 in the Principles of Economics. So there was a tool for investigation, and this view suggested that there was a natural way of proceeding. That natural way of proceeding was to simply cut wages if there was unemployment, and assume that there was no effect on anyone else. The example we looked at earlier, well, if the price of one good increases, there may be less income left available to purchase other goods. In this way, all markets will be considered to be linked. So we can envisage all markets being linked. They're linked through incomes. And if wages in one market is reduced, then less is spent on other markets, so those other markets will have to cut their prices, which will have to cut the wages of the people working in those markets. they in turn will have less to spend on the original market. So this could actually be a spiral downwards. So we have to recognize the markets are linked. General equilibrium is a more realistic view. It must be contrasted, the partial equilibrium, with the general equilibrium approach. The general equilibrium approach allows for the connectivity of markets. The markets are interrelated and interconnected, and what happens in one will affect the other. Now, the second problem is the workers will resist cutting wages. There are two types of wage we need to consider. One is real wages. Real wages represents the purchasing power of the wage. Real wage refers to how many goods and services can be purchased out of that wage. In a sense, it's connecting wages with goods and services purchased. It's the amount of goods and services that the worker may purchase. So real means real goods and services that can be bought with the wage. That's the real wage. Clearly, if prices were rising, then real wages would be falling, because if prices were rising and the wage had remained the same, then the worker is able to purchase less. So real wages would be falling. And contrasted with what we call nominal wage. This is the amount of the wage as measured in currency units. So a worker may say his nominal wage is so much per week, or so much per month. That's the nominal. That's the number of currency units, the number of pounds received every week, or the number of rupees, or the number of euros, the number of dollars. That's the number. It's the amount of cash that's being paid every week or every month. That's the nominal wage. The real wage is what can be bought out of the nominal wage, converting the nominal wage into goods and services. If a worker's paid £100, this is the nominal wage. If prices double, then the real wage is halved. The £100 will only buy half as much as before the price increase. So we have the nominal wage of £100 per week, but if prices doubled over that week, then in fact the £100 will only buy £50 worth at the original prices. So if prices double, nominal wage is reduced. Takes us on to something called money illusion. Now Keynes coined this term. Keynes assumed that workers would resist a reduction in nominal wage, but would tolerate a reduction in real wage. So workers will fight to maintain their nominal wage, but they don't make reference to real wages. He assumed that workers suffer from what he called money illusion. Workers were fixated by money, not by the goods and services that the money could purchase. And he assumed that they would not make a connection between the money income and its purchasing power. So Keynes assumed that workers didn't understand real wages. I suppose that's probably the best way of putting it. Keynes assumed that workers would work for nominal wage and were happy if they saw nominal wage being maintained. But they didn't refer to real wages. The classical economists' belief in economy's ability to maintain full employment was based on two assumptions. So to bring about full employment, first of all, an aggregate deficiency of demand can never occur because supply creates its own demand. And that's known as Say's law. And secondly, the operation of the free market system will automatically remove any unemployment through fluctuations in the wage rate. So according to the classical economists, full employment can't happen. Less than full employment can't happen. So less than full employment, unemployment, will be removed because supply creates its own demand, and because if there's flexibility in the labour market, wages will adjust and full employment will emerge. So unemployment can't happen under the classical system. That was the belief. If we have a labour market and the wage rate is W1, then the supply would be greater than demand at W1. That means the difference between demand and supply at W1 is unemployment. To get rid of unemployment, the wage rate would be reduced, and that would bring about full employment. Now, Say's law. Well, Jean-Baptiste Say, the French economist who lived between 1767 and 1832, he argued that persistent unemployment due to overproduction was unlikely because supply creates its own demand. Now, in this diagram, all incomes are immediately spent on the consumption of goods and services. So if we take firms, we take companies, the companies pay out factor incomes, including wages to labour. Labour is a factor of production. And that flows to the households, and the households spend it, but spend it on the output of the firms. So that diagram is closed. It's a closed system. There's no leakage out of the system. There are no injections and no leakages. It's a closed system, so therefore there can't be oversupply. The diagram also assumes that there is no government activity and that it is a closed economy, no imports and no exports. So it's a very simple, straightforward diagram, and it means the firms pay the workers buy goods and services. But those are the goods and services that other workers have made. So there can't be an oversupply according to Say's law. If a firm pays households X pounds, then the households must spend X pounds on output of firms. There's no savings in our diagram, no imports, no exports. It's a very simple, straightforward, closed system. The households receive X pounds, so the households must spend X pounds. There's no savings, so they spend X pounds. There's no imports, so they buy the output of the firms, and in that way, in a sense, it gyrates. It just simply goes round in a circle. The X pounds flows round in a circle. If the economy is open, that is, it engages in international trade, the classical economists did not see this as an obstacle to full employment, provided that all prices are flexible. So the classical economists are really keen on the flexibility of prices. If all prices are flexible, then the economy could be open and it still would lead to full employment. Imports are called a leakage out of the circular flow of income. Imports is when money, domestically, money leaves the country to pay for the imports. So foreigners who export into the country, and those become our imports, they have to be paid. So therefore money leaves the country to pay for the imports. The classical economists believed in fixed exchange rates, and this meant that imports would have to be paid out of reserves. And they believed that this would be gold. So if we paid for the imports in gold, then we'd have less gold available in the country. So there would be less income flowing around the system because the money was backed by gold in the classical system. Back in history, it was backed by gold. So if we were importing more than we were exporting, then gold is leaving the country. That meant there would be less money in the country. But if there's less money in the country, we're less able to buy the imports. So the imports will be choked off. Money, as I said, was backed by gold. They believed that currency should be backed by gold because that gave the currency status, it gave it reputation, it gave it a solid base, and it could not be manipulated by governments. It was backed by gold. Now, in the situation we just talked about, the gold would leave the country and reduce the amount of money in circulation. So imports, net imports, meant that money was leaving the country, or if you like, rather, gold was leaving the country. This in turn meant that the money supply would be reduced, and therefore the country would be less able to buy the imports. So imports would be choked off because we're not able to pay for them because there is less money in the country. The only way we could have more imports is if we had more gold. There's also a price effect associated with the system. As the money supply is reduced, prices will tend to fall because of reduced demand. This will make domestic output cheap as compared with imports. And this comparative or competitive advantage, I should say, will choke off imports and stimulate exports. So as money leaves the country, as gold leaves the country because we have too many imports, thereby reducing the amount of money in the country, this will cause prices in the country to fall because now there's less money available to buy the goods and services of industry, so prices will fall. But as prices fall, that will choke off imports because now domestic goods are cheaper than imports. It's also the case it will stimulate exports because foreigners will now see goods and services produced domestically as cheap, and they will want to buy our exports. So that's the basis of the classical system. To get a fuller appreciation of this mechanism, it's best to study the Fisher equation of exchange and see how that works. But there are many aspects associated with the classical system. What I've given here is a good introduction, in a sense, to some of the issues associated with it. But essentially, it comes down to a belief in the market system, a belief that the market system can solve all problems. So unemployment cannot exist because conditions in the labour market have to be flexible. And also, because of Say's law, there can't be overproduction. It's not possible to have overproduction because that cycle that we talked about from households to firms, that's a closed cycle. And if we did allow it to be open with imports and exports, because money they assumed was backed by gold, that also would be self-correcting. The classical system had a few problems. For a start, one problem was that sometimes people in different parts of the world would discover gold. So it was sometimes just based on luck where you lived as to how prosperous you are. But there again, I suppose we could say that today. But sometimes people found gold, and therefore the world economic system would have to adjust to a new supply of gold coming onto the market. There was no reason as to why the world economy would have to adjust other than somebody was lucky enough to find a lot of gold. It's also the case that clearly there was unemployment. The predictions of the model and the facts did not coincide. The model predicted no unemployment, but there was unemployment. There was mass unemployment. In Europe, in England, right throughout the world. And economies were growing slowly, some were not growing at all. So the facts of what was happening did not fit the nice, neat, theoretical perspective that was offered by the classical economists. From the end of the First World War in 1918 up to the start of the Second World War in 1939, a lot of Europe, a lot of America as well, had suffered great poverty and great deprivation. America was the land of opportunity. People wanted to go to America because they felt it would have a better life. And yet in America, that society was wrecked by the Great Depression, by the aftermath of the Great Depression, was even wrecked by natural disaster, the Dust Bowl in the Midwest, when agriculture, land and productivity failed. But in Europe it was also the case, and some historians suggest that the Second World War was in a sense caused by the deprivation in the interwar period. So what the classical economists were offering was a very neat theoretical perspective, but in truth there was a lot of unemployment, a lot of hunger, a lot of deprivation in most economies of the world. And this did not accord with this very straightforward piece of thinking about economics. So clearly something was amiss. And that's why Keynesian economics was adopted in 1945. Keynes offered a totally different perspective, an interventionist perspective, suggesting that capitalism could not be trusted on its own to provide full employment. It needed government intervention. And of course, government intervention in the economy is seen as socialist. And then there was the fight between people who believed in the market and people who believed the markets were, in a sense, unstable and needed regulation and needed intervention. And eventually, Keynesianism broke down in the mid-1970s, 74, 73, something of that period. And one of the reasons why it broke down was its inability to cope with inflation. And that's one of the problems with Keynesianism. Keynes assumed that the workers suffered from money illusion. Money illusion means the workers didn't make reference to real wages, what was happening to prices, what was happening to inflation. But when inflation becomes very steep, and in England inflation was well over 20%, getting on for 30% in parts of the early 70s, then inevitably governments have to question whether that policy, the Keynesian policy, was also working, and they needed to find something to solve the problem of inflation. This is all subject matter for other videos, and I just wanted to give some of the background to it here. But now what we want to do is to look at the Fisher equation. It's been on the slide now for some time. So let's have a look at the Fisher equation and see what Fisher had to say, in particular about control of inflation. So the classical system with government activity, well, taxation is another leakage from the circular flow of income. The classical economists believe that the government should always balance its budget, and therefore taxation should always equal government expenditure. And that's the final word we'll have on the classical system in this video. Essentially, it's one of equilibrium throughout. Even in fiscal policy, what the government takes in tax revenue is what exactly it should spend. It should be a balanced budget. So everything is balanced. But as I said, it was not fitting in with the facts. The facts was that economies were not prospering under this particular perspective. So let's talk about the Fisher equation of exchange. This is known as the quantity theory of money. Now, the classical economists saw relative prices as flexible and the economy constantly adjusting to full employment. That's what we've just talked about. So the classical economists saw the economy constantly adjusting to full employment because prices were flexible, wages were flexible upwards and downwards. The general price level they saw as being determined by the quantity of money circulating in the economy. So we have two concepts here. The first concept is relative prices. That's one market against the other. One set of prices against another price. So what's the price in one market versus the price in a different market? That's relative prices. And that's determined by supply and demand in each market. But the general price level, the overall price level, that's determined by the quantity of money circulating in the economy. So they saw the quantity of money as determining the general price level. And don't forget, they also saw money as being backed by gold. And if the supply of gold fell, perhaps because of high imports, there would be less money in the economy, and this would affect the general price level. Let's look at the Fisher equation in a little more detail. The equation is made up from four variables as follows. M is the money supply within the economy. V is known as the velocity of circulation of money. I'll explain this later. But we have two variables so far. M is the money supply within the economy, and V is the velocity of circulation of money. Essentially, rather than just leave it, it means it's the number of times we use a unit of money in a given time period. So if I have a £5 note in England and I use the £5 note to buy something, the value of the transaction is £5. It's a £5 note and I've used it once. I've used that one £5 note once. So it's 5 multiplied by 1, which is £5. But I could take the same £5 note, or I could take it and spend it in the shop. That's one. But the shopkeeper could spend it again on the same day. Take the same £5 note and buy something else. Buy something for the shop. In which case the £5 note has acted like one £10 note, because it's worked twice. It's £5, it's been used once, and then it's been used again. So it's £5 twice, the same as £10. So the velocity of circulation of money in that example would be 2. So this is the average number of times a unit of currency will change hands in a given time period. Now, give a simple example. If V equals 3, the velocity of circulation of money is 3, then on average a unit of currency, example, say a £10 note, will be used 3 times in a given time period. For example, in a week. Just go back here for a second. That means that the £10 note is acting like £30 because it's been used 3 times in a week. So it's doing the same work as £30 that's circulating once. P. Well, P is the average price level. It applies to all goods and services, including final goods and services, intermediate goods and services, and raw materials. P applies to everything, not just the final goods that we see in the shops. Work in progress, raw materials, P applies to everything. This may be considered as a drawback, since in general the consumer is only interested in the price of final goods and services. So really, as consumers, we're just really interested in the final ones. We don't want to buy the raw materials and make the thing ourselves. We want to find the product already made. We're after the final product, generally speaking. And T, this is the total number of transactions in the economy in a given time period. And this includes all transactions, intermediate and final. So companies buying raw materials, that's a transaction. And the final transactions is when we buy something in the shops. So it's the total number of transactions. So now we have, just go back to the previous one for a second, we have MV equals PT. Now, the value of money spent, MV, must equal the value of money received, PT. They are identical. So, what I spend is, let's say, £10, and that same £10 might be used by the shopkeeper in the same day to buy something else. So now the £10 has acted like £20. Now the number of transactions, well in this case it's simple, the number of transactions is 2. So the price, the amount spent is 20, the number of transactions 2, so the price, the average price must be 10. MV is identical to PT. It's not an equation, it's an identity. MV, and it's written with 3 little lines, not equals, it's got 3 little lines to say it is an identity. In mathematics, that's what we mean. The left-hand side is identical to the right-hand side. So if the money supply is 10, the velocity of circulation V is equal to 3, the average price level is equal to 5, then the total number of transactions must be equal to 6. T is equal to 6. The expression MV is equal to the value of money spent in a given time period. So MV is the amount we spend. And of course, PT is the amount received. That's why they're identical. What we spend, someone else must receive it. If I spend £5 in the shop, my expenditure of £5 must be identical at that moment to the receipts in the shop. The shopkeeper receives the £5, I spend it. They're identical. So MV equals, in the previous example, MV equals 30. The expression PT is equal to the value of the receipts in the given time period. In the example, there are 6 transactions which take place at an average price of 5. So 6 times 5 is equal to 30. So the two sides are identical. Now the amount that consumers spend, MV, must be the same as the amount that the producers receive, PT. As I said, if I spend £5 in a shop, my expenditure of £5 is identical to the amount received in the shop at that moment. So my expenditure and receipts are the same. They're identical. So one person's expenditure is another person's receipts. So this being the case, MV must be identical to PT. It's not an equation, it's an identity. Now when we examine it in the context of the classical system, we can note the following. First of all, we talk about T as a constant. The classical economists assumed that all prices were flexible and that the economy would move to full employment automatically. Then, the economy is operating at full employment, the amount of transactions will be fixed at that level. So T is a constant. T is fixed at the full employment level of output. And once we're at the full employment level of output, output can't be increased more than that. And because of the assumptions that classical economists make, output won't be less than full employment as well. So T is a constant. Full employment defines the capacity of the economy, and the number of transactions cannot exceed this level. Now V is the velocity of circulation of money. Now that's a constant. It's more difficult to see. In the long run, the velocity of circulation of money will settle down to a constant figure. Let's have a look at a diagram to illustrate this. Let's say we plot the velocity of circulation of money on the vertical axis. That's the number of times a unit of money is used in a given time period. And over time, velocity of circulation of money may have this short run up and down. For example, in the UK, in around end of January, February, that sort of period, I'll just put the cursor onto the screen, that sort of period, we're going to find very little economic activity. People are recovering from New Year and Christmas and saving up for their holidays, so there's not a lot of expenditure, nothing much going on. So the velocity of circulation will have dipped. Then the summer is coming, so people start to spend more for the summer. And the velocity will increase. They'll go on holidays and they'll have more outside living and parties over the summertime and so on. Coming up to Christmas, big expenditure at Christmas. The New Year. And after the New Year, it starts to dip down into end of January, February again. So what we see is this this short-run fluctuation in the value of fee over the period of, let's say, a year. But the classical economists were long-run. They were not interested in the short run. And as such, they simply took an average. And the average is the long run V. The long run is just the average. It evens out the dips and the peaks. So it's a constant. So they assumed that V is a constant. V in the short run may vary because of seasonal factors such as Christmas and summer holidays, as I said. At these times, the velocity of circulation of money will increase relative to the rest of the year. So Christmas, summer holidays, V will tend to be more. Over a long period, these variations will average out and a constant figure can be calculated. Now if V and T are constants, then we've now got V and T as a constant. I'll put a line across the top to indicate that they are constants. Now, if they're constants, then any change in M, which we write as delta M, delta being the Greek letter, which is used in mathematics to indicate a change. So any change in M must lead to a change in P, because V and T are constants. Therefore, delta M leads to delta P. In this way, the Fisher equation postulates a relationship between the money supply and the price level. Now this is very important, because this is the way currently governments see how to control inflation in the economy. When inflation is rising, they restrict the money supply. They may do it by altering the price of money, the rate of interest. But this is the way in which governments try to control inflation, by controlling the money supply. The policy implications here is that if the government wishes to control the rate of inflation, it should reduce the money supply. If it wants to reduce inflation, it must reduce the money supply. Because any change in the money supply, if the money supply, say, doubled, then the price level should double. If the money supply is halved, the price level should fall to half as well. Now, criticisms of the Fisher equation. Well, as a mathematical expression, the Fisher equation cannot be criticized. It's simple, it's straightforward. It can't really be criticized mathematically. The only, perhaps, criticism we could make is the fact that it's not an equation. It's called Fisher's equation, but it's not really an equation. It's an identity. But it's very logical in the way it goes about explaining the relationship between the money supply and inflation. As a tautological relationship, it's unassailable. And it is a tautology. One side is the same as the other. The problem arises when we try to manipulate the expression to explain the price level. Fisher equation is used to explain the relationship between the money supply and the price level by assuming that two of the variables, M and V, are constant. So the relationship between the money supply and inflation, or the price level, that relationship requires that M and V are constants. It's easy to overlook this fact, but we only got this far by assuming that M and V were constants. If you look back, I put a little line on top of M and V to show that they were constants. Now, in a slump period, an increase in the money supply may not be borrowed for investment purposes. Instead, the effects of this increase in the money supply is to depress the velocity of circulation of money. So if the economy is going through a real slump, if it's very low levels of economic activity, then if there was more borrowing, it may not go for investment purposes. The money supply may not be a constant. The money supply may vary. People may demand money at particular times and for investment purposes or for all sorts of reasons. So M may not be a constant. It could be the case that the money supply increases and the velocity of circulation of money falls. So, for example, if more money is borrowed, then perhaps the money is not moved, is not used as frequently because there's more of it in the system. So V would fall. So there could be a relationship here that leads to a breakdown of the Fisher equation. The relationship between changes in the money supply and changes in prices could be that changes in the money supply influence V. They don't influence P, the price level, as assumed. The longer the time period, the greater the chances that V is a constant. So the Fisher equation is assumed to work in the long run. And this is the reason why classical economics is assumed to be a long-run theory. It takes the long run before the policies work, or so it's believed. Keynesianism, by contrast, is seen as short run. The government intervenes to regulate prices or regulate the balance of payments or whatever. The government steps into the economy and uses instruments and uses monetary policy and fiscal policy and so on to try and influence certain outcomes. That's short run. In periods when there are unemployed resources, an economy, in an economy, the money supply may attract these resources into production. So it could be the case that changes in the money supply will be deflected into production. It doesn't affect inflation. It goes into affect production. So it would influence the number of transactions possible. T may be variable as a consequence. In this case, an increase in the money supply leads to an increase in transactions, and that also does not affect the price level. So we can see two big ways in which the Fisher equation does not work. That means the Fisher equation is the relationship money and prices is not guaranteed. Changes in the money supply may lead to increased transactions, or changes in the money supply may lead to a fall in the velocity of circulation. In either case, it does not manifest itself in a change in the price level. So the linkage between the money supply and the price level, using the Fisher equation, is debatable. We also need to look at M. How is the money supply measured? It's easy for us to talk about changing the money supply. Changing the money supply leads to a change in prices, but how do we measure the money supply? There are different measures of the money supply. For example, we could measure the money supply by notes and coins in circulation. We could say that's the money supply. But that may not be the money supply. The money supply may also involve credit cards, which are not notes and coins in circulation. It's credit cards. And if we look at someone with a credit card, how much money have they got on them at any moment in time? They may have some coins and some notes, but those are small. They could actually go to a shop and buy something quite big. They could go to a shop perhaps and buy a television. They don't have notes and coins. So it could be notes and coins plus bank credit, the amount that they can borrow off the bank. That could be the money supply. It could be notes and coins in circulation plus bank credit plus money held externally in foreign banks, because some people have money in other countries. The problem is, which definition of money is correct? There's no hard and fast answer to this one. So we talk about changes in M leading to changes in P. It sounds very clever, but we don't know what M is. And that's a problem. We also have criticisms related to V. We've already noted that V may vary in the short run. Remember the diagram we had earlier where it was like a sine curve. But we don't, that's just a way of drawing it. But it just means it's variable. It's not a constant. The point to note here is that the classical economists were concerned with the long run, and V is considered to be constant in the long run. And that's why the classical economists emphasized the long run. They see their theory as working in the long run. The problem with the long run is we're not too sure how long the long run is. Is it a year? Is it 10 years? Is it 50 years? Is it a week? We don't know. What's the long run? So it makes it very difficult to use it in practice if we don't know what the long run is. P represents all prices as well, including work in progress and raw materials. And we're not interested in the price of intermediate goods. And this may be viewed as a drawback. We're just interested in the price of final goods. When I go to buy bread, I'm not really that concerned about the price of flour or the price of yeast or whatever goes into bread. I'm not even concerned too much about the energy it took to make the bread. I'm interested at that moment in time in the price of bread, not the price of the intermediate goods that went to make up the bread. And yet the Fisher equation explains all prices. I'm just interested in the final price. So that could be a drawback. So what we've done in this talk is to discuss the classical economists and what they considered the way the economy worked and what they believe or believed. Understand them is to understand current policy to some extent, because when Keynesianism collapsed in the mid-70s, governments started to go back to the classical thinking, back to the classical world, and a lot of policies are to some extent based on this type of thinking. So it's important that we understand the classical economists, but we should also be in a position to criticize them. And then one big application is that of how to control inflation, for example. And to this end, we looked at Fisher, Irving Fisher, 1911, on his ideas about the quantity theory of money. And we developed a very interesting expression that delta M leads to delta P. A change in the money supply changes the price level. And then we went on to criticize this relationship, looking at different variables throughout. And that concludes this class. It's quite a long class, so I hope you've had some breaks and come back to it. It's worth looking at it a couple of times, making your own notes, and remembering to have breaks as you go through it. It's an important class. It does try to understand current economic policy, how governments attempt to control inflation, and look at how current policy is based, to some extent at least, on the classical system, and you will find connections in what governments say connected to the classical beliefs. So it's important that we understand where these come from. Well, that's all we're going to deal with here, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.